So I am a happily retired global citizen with a Swiss passport. Happily retired, it's a fantastic state in life because you can choose what you want to do. Only when you are a student or when you are retired, you have that privilege. So make ample use of it, because the span between finishing the studies and getting retired is considerable. But I'm sure you will manage. You mentioned in the introduction that I chair Global Ethics Net. That is the biggest e-library on ethics. We started a couple of years ago with a few people, because many students, professors in developing countries, they don't have access to books, to scientific journals. So we managed to negotiate for them and started to build it up with support from India and others. But I have a few other mandates just for transparency reason. I also chair the African Innovation Foundation, member of the board of the CODA, the Coalition for Dialogue on Africa, that deals with integration in Africa. But I have a number of board mandates in foundations. But I'm also active in the private sector, where I'm heading two companies, one in alternative energy and one in investment consulting. So this shows you can benefit a lot from development cooperation when you do it thoroughly enough, because it's an amazing learning ground. So if you allow, I will just lead through a number of thoughts I want to share with you by showing you just titles, a few hints, and then I would like a little bit in response to your reaction to go more deeper into it, or maybe hurry through, because we have limited time. Now, I think what matters a lot, and what I experienced during my 15 years as head of Swiss Development Cooperation before I retired 3 years ago, was, and my question still is, did the shift of paradigm really happen? That we went from aid to cooperation. Everybody's talking about, but I'm not so sure whether that shift really happened. It might have happened in smaller countries with bilateral. It might have a cooperation, might have happened with some multilateral institutions. But you still find a lot of, let's say, countries with considerable political arm-twisting power that they still look at development cooperation as a matter of aid and not of cooperation, because cooperation would mean partnership. And partnership means you sit together, you define together what you want to do, and you share your responsibility. But at the end, the one who wants that development has to be in the driver's seat. I still hear also in Swiss Parliament that many parliamentarians come forward saying, look, why are you so split in international cooperation? Why our country cannot take the patronage over that country, Luxembourg over that one, Austria over that one, Finland over another one? Would that not be better? And that, of course, implies to go back to the 60s, the kind of patronage to tell to the others what they have to do. This is a completely wrong way. It's turning back the wheel for 40 years, but it's still in the mind of a lot of politicians. So, in reality, if you really go for cooperation, for partnership, you should avoid patronage. You have to go a way to respect the partner, to know the partner, and to go for commonly agreed upon objectives. But for that, we have a considerable multitude in the international system. First, we always have a kind of a competitive situation between bilateral and multilateral. There is no recipe, there is no saying what is best. But definitely we need both. But in my opinion and experience, we should look at both in a complementary manner. The multilateral people and institutions can do many things bilaterals cannot, for the mere size or for the governance structure or for others. But there are many things bilateral can do better. I would say the more you go from macro to meso to micro level, the bilaterals are better from the micro to meso towards macro than maybe the multilaterals. But that is where the agenda of both actually should meet and can meet. Financing versus implementation. I mean, we have a lot of financial institutes, the World Bank, regional banks. I'm not so sure what their future is. Sometimes I wonder, and I do some thoughts, where is the international finance system going to be in 15 or 20 years from now? There are 2, 3 major challenges for them. First, there is a considerable overlapping between the World Bank and the regional development banks. Second, most of them still follow the so-called national lending, the national government, but they are stuck in the pipelines, and sub-sovereign lending would be the big issue. But how to organize, that means to give money to provinces or to cantons or whatever you name them. Is that the feasible way? A third issue is, why do these banks go into the private sector or private capital market or others? But what bothered me over the 15 years is that normally the capitals governing the relationship with the banks are from the Ministry of Finance, and there starts the issue of coherence in policy. Coherence starts back home. I will come back on that. And then you have other partners for the UN system, more diplomat loaded, and then you have some institutions where the so-called development people are going. And the development people very often behave like in a protected workshop, because they don't like to be looked upon over their shoulder very often, unfortunately. And this is strange. Those who want to go for change very often are not the most open one for change when their own situation is touched. When you look at the scope of factors, you see these different partners in the whole system. And let me come to the international world in development cooperation, bilateral, multilateral, NGOs, governments, private sector. When you imagine the whole system, I always, forgive me, go back to a metaphor and say, look at it like a clock. A clock normally is working very precisely to indicate the time. When it's not working, not indicating the time well, you do not change the whole system. You change maybe a little bit in the system. The problem of the international system is that you have a multitude of partners, institutions. You have even major agendas allocated to certain institutions, but they always go beyond their limits. They always, it's a little bit like in your garden, the apple of your neighbor is very often tasting better than your own apple. Or they build fences around them. Many of these actors do not like competition. They do not like to get away from their well-protected behavior patterns. Many of them are behaving in their own world like the diplomats do, protected by the protocol. So the diplomats and the development people are a little bit like the military people. They follow the doctrines. Those three are not bound to be, let's say, foremost open to change. I'm sorry to say that. I served in all three. But we could do better in addressing the issues, in going for coherence inside the system. But the system is not to outcompete actors, but it is competitive, and it is run the way that you have to deliver. And in my opinion, those who are not able to deliver should not go to the table. How often do you have, after disasters, war situations, media-driven presence of actors, and a few months later, there are even not 10% of those actors there? How often did I experience, because in Switzerland we have disaster relief, humanitarian relief, development cooperation, bilateral, multilateral support to the countries in transition all in one. And how often I experienced to see NGOs, governments or others, or ministers coming the second day of the disaster, telling how bad the situation is, but certainly not helping to those people who had to mastermind the situation. So this mediatization influences the work of the international system too much. And then it is an interesting case to study governance. Very often NGOs tend to think they are not subject to learn on governance. Luxembourg, of course, excluded, but in some other countries. Very often governments, they look at the private sector, oh, these people, they don't understand anything. And the private sector people, oh, these government bureaucrats, they know anyway nothing about efficiency. So everybody is talking about the multi-stakeholder partnership approach, but it's so difficult to implement it. But it's feasible. It's feasible when you go and to the objectives. That reminds my ski trainer when I was in my young years, a ski racer. In training, our coach, he brought us to the finishing line first. And then he said, now we are going to exercise. Because that finishing line you should keep in your mind for your life. That is why you are training. That is why you are exercising. And in many activities in life, it's a little bit the same. We do not go to the finishing line or imagine the finishing line where we want to go early enough and then prepare the way to reach those objectives. But in development cooperation, we should. And that brings me to this issue of conditionality. This conditionality is a terrible sickness. Because it's so easy to discuss about preconditions. What should be fulfilled before you give, before you do, before you act? It is a mere sickness, but it's a sign of weakness. Because very often the people do not know what they want. And in the last 10, 15 years, I experienced often that it became a playground for diplomats. Because you don't need to know a lot, and you can do a lot of political staging without instructions, just doing things your way. Conditionality leads very often to undue linkages, to instrumentalization of cooperation for other purposes, and not poverty alleviation or poverty reduction. And that is what I think we, in the international system, still did not manage over the last 40 years. This is terrible to say, and it probably will never be perfectly the case that we can realize that, because you always run into people, especially the traditional people in foreign policy. They say the major aim of foreign policy is to represent one's own country's interest, mine included. That is still in the head of most of the diplomats. But I say this is okay, but that's not all. That's not all. You have also to know and to take in consideration what are the interests of other actors at your table. Because if you go to the Cancun or another trade round, having only your thing in your mind, only your agricultural policy's interest, and you exclude the whole situation of agricultural policy in developing countries and so on, then you do more harm than you do good in safeguarding your short-term interests. That shift of paradigm has not been realized adequately yet. Conditionality, in my opinion, is part and must be part of the objectives. If you go to the finishing line and you say, together with your partners, we want to achieve that objective in 3, 5, 7, or 10 years, then you come back to where you are, and then you have to start to open the way to reach those objectives. And to open the way might be full of hindrances or obstacles. But that is what I mean to get rid of conditionality, replace conditionality by objectives, and start working. Do it. When Jim Wolfensee was head of the World Bank and Jan Pronk, the Dutch Minister for Development Cooperation, they were always competing with one word: action, implement, action, action. One day I told Jan Pronk in a big meeting, I said, look, Jan, I am not a politician like you, but since years I have to deal with politicians. They always tell me action, action. But we need results. You can be terribly active and very, very active in doing the wrong thing. So being active is not the policy of realizing results. Results, managing for results is key, and not activism. The question always comes up about local contribution. 14 years ago, I asked a group of professors in ethics in Germany, Austria, Switzerland, to reflect on whether we need a new ethic or new ethics for international cooperation in time of globalization. They came to the conclusion, no, but the situation has changed. The old paradigm of partition, like the Holy Saint George, give part of what you have to the poor, that alone does not work anymore in the future. It should be combined with self-enlightened interest, taking into account the other partner's interest. And then you might come to a kind of partnership. And I think that has a lot to do with the approach. I call that the investor's approach. When I started in '93, and I had a background in private industry, before entering the diplomacy and between I was back in private industry, I said, how can I guarantee that my staff in Mali or Burkina or in other countries, they do not come with projects they are mostly pleased of? Are we really doing the right thing and not just things right? And how can I go for that? And then I asked some industrialists, how do they do that when they search for partners in investment? And it was interesting to cope with those answers. They said, if you go for an investor's approach, whether your partner has 5, 10, or 20, or 50%, but it needs to be a partner. And second, even poor people, they can mobilize resources, be it in kind or financial. So I started to change the approach completely. No charity, only charity in relief, in humanitarian activities, but in development cooperation, no projects without local contributions. And it changed a lot. It became more efficient, it became quicker, and it became more sustainable because people started to care. But the people suffering most were my staff, because they could not just do what they pleased to do. They had to do what our partners wanted them to do. So it's important to have an adequate distance to your partners and to the situation, but also an adequate closeness. Maybe you remember or you know the philosopher Peter Sloterdijk. Once he told me that he has his monthly meeting with Gerhard Schröder and he does not know what to tell him. Then I told him, maybe I can give him a hint, because I just had a meeting with the pilot, the balloon pilot, Bertrand Piccard, the one who with his British colleague flew around the world. And I asked Bertrand, what is a balloon pilot doing when there is no wind? And he said, you have basically two options. Either you wait or you change altitude. If you lower, you have to get heat off. If you want to get up, you have more heat and you have to take weight off. And then Sloterdijk told me, that's it. That's what I have to tell him. You need sometimes more distance to what you do, and sometimes you have to go closer. And I think I learned from that metaphor or that experience that it is in life, not only in development cooperation, very often important to lean back to get adequate distance and maybe then also to get closer. Especially important is it when you are not sure whether you are active on micro, meso or macro level. And very often, as I mentioned, the bilateralists are rather from micro to meso, but they should always bear in mind what is the policy line they are referring their project to. And those who do the policy dialogue and policy discussion, they should be aware that there are actors at the lower end. They should know whether they can implement that policy adequately or not. That is one dimension of coherence. The other dimension of coherence is, of course, the thematic inclusiveness. And very often we criticize the UN, but the UN is functioning a little bit like a national government. You have the environmental specialists, you have the agro, you have the lawyers, you have the law department, you have the development specialists, or migration specialists. And when you deal with those issues in a country, be it in a policy dialogue or be it in projects, then of course you have first to see that your acting or your behaving is coherent with your country's policy. And then you have to match that with the country's policy where you are in. And that is extremely difficult. The issue of coherence is so key also for sustainability that it is worthwhile to spend days on exercising coherence. There might never be complete coherence. Probably it's not feasible. But their politicians must have choices. They must know what is more important for them. Very often I was defeated in internal politics in my country. Simple because the national, so-called national interest in trade rounds, domestic agriculture always won against development. Nearly, but at the end they started to become insecure, and that was quite a success. And when you speak about migration, it's a typical case where people want to make a kind of mathematical calculation that development cooperation should bring the refugees back. But the development people say, yeah, we have to do more in those countries in order to avoid migration. But then you have also today an international system. UN Convention, they were great in the 50s, 60s, but is the system really still practicable when you have 2 to 4% of so-called real asylum, given asylum, compared to the so-called flow of illegal migrants? Do we not have to change the system? We cannot use internal political means or the money from development cooperation to build walls on the borders. So these are issues that show that development issues, development policies should be practically on the agenda of any foreign policy commission in any parliament, be it in Europe or in any other country. But it is not. It's very often not, because it's just national interest, diplomatic protection, and so on. But why this is not feasible? Maybe politicians have short memories. They are elected for 4 years. But let's tell them, please, beside your 4-year thinking and your concerns to be re-elected, there are dimensions of world development you have to look at on a 20 to 30 years line and time framework. Otherwise, you are not responsibly acting. And we have that in democratic countries in our hand. The selection of local partners obviously is extremely important. I did not make too many friends when I developed an indicator in our priority countries. I always wanted to know whether there were more private or small companies newly registered or more NGOs. And I can tell you, in all those countries where more NGOs were registered in a given time framework than private sector companies, things went wrong. Because most of those NGOs were just there for their own survival, but not really for going beyond that. And in Pakistan, when I asked young people, what are your priorities at the university, they said, first, we want a job with an international company. If that is not working, we want to go to government. And third, if that is not working, we create an NGO. We need NGOs. We need good NGOs. So we need, in all levels and spheres of society, good actors. But we need to be very selective when we make those choices, as you are also selective in other areas. And once you have found your partners, it's worthwhile to invest and not to change them. You also don't change the bakery when you are happy with the bread you get every now and then. There are certain cultures in NGOs who do not like to take risks, but they just transfer the costs. That is true because very often they don't have risk capital. They don't have enough reserves to take certain risks. And that is different to private sector partners. Let's jump now to go from program versus project approach. This relates to the macro, meso, micro level of activities. But what we found out in years is if you have a number of projects, let's say in agriculture or in the water sector, you need to have a reference to policies, and policies, programs relate to policies. So you have a level of discussions with your partners and from there on you derive and you define the projects. I think when you do programs, you need the project view, but you need, when you do project, also the program view and the long-term frame. This is another sickness. I will come back on that, this short-term thinking. It's a little bit like in an IMED management school meeting, an entrepreneur asked the professor, how would you describe the time we are in? And he said, oh, we are in a period, in a transfer period towards uncertainty. And then I said, yeah, but in development cooperation, we are always in such states and environments. And then he said, yeah, that is, but the difference is you go with strategies and the companies do not apply strategies. Their key word is profit maximization or is personal gear, but not strategy and realization or long-term thinking. So the advantage in development cooperation you have is really going along in a long way. When I mention here, avoid the piloting syndrome, very often when we are not so sure to start or where to go, we name, maybe it's easier in an administrative way, we name it by doing a pilot. Once in a meeting in Senegal with a group of NGOs, we looked into the effect of piloting. Pilots are excellent when you are really not sure where to go. But after a certain period of time, let's say an open beginning, you have to define your direction where you want to go. But it became an attitude of a lot of people. Doing pilots gives quick money and helps this own institutional survival. But the scaling up is not followed because either the financial means are not there or the incentives are missing to do so. So the question is often, are there incentives? What are those incentives? In my opinion, they are always incentives. Incentives in how to design the project, incentives with regard to remuneration, incentives with regard to ownership and participation, but it's worthwhile to consider them in the good local cultural context, and it is worthwhile to mobilize indigenous knowledge, because very often coming from the outside, not knowing really what is going on is a big hindrance. So knowledge for development is very often knowledge of development and is very often related to indigenous knowledge. Risk governance. We all look at risks. We often do assess the risks, but the problem is, even in the private sector or even in governments, is the governing of risks. I am a member of the board of the International Risk Governance Council. We set up that research network because of that. If you look at BP Gulf of Mexico, we looked into the fact, why did it really happen? Because they made amazing risk analysis, but nobody was looking at the overall, the whole of the risks, of the so-called the governance of the risk, how to deal with those risks. Everybody had a compartmentation of the risk. And very often when you go in the private sector through the risk chain, you find the same. And often in development or developing cooperation projects, the question is also how we look at the governance of risks. Not to avoid also the question whether the right risks are really looked at or, if possible, insured. But I think we could save a lot of development money if we would be able to convince prime ministers and presidents of country to have a chief risk officer in their cabinet who is doing nothing else than evaluating, assessing and validating risks and looking at coherent policies, what risks are covered or dealt with in an appropriate way or not. The insurance companies will not do that. They will just insure the easiest risk normally, not the most complicated one. But the problem is that the biggest risk in industrial countries, you have about 90% of the risks insured. In developing countries, you have even not 10% of the risks insured. But in developing countries, you have 98% of the victims of disasters and catastrophes. So this risk governance issue is not an easy one, but we should look at it from a higher perspective. Not to talk about the controlling. Very often, also in the agencies I headed, we were much stronger in operational controlling than in the strategic controlling. Operational controlling means you are checking out, you are monitoring, and you want to know whether you do the things right. But the strategic controlling is whether you do the right thing. And you can, as I mentioned, be very active and terribly effective and successful in doing the wrong thing. So that is where you can save money. That is, in my opinion, where we could do better in the international system. But when you find out that things do not go well, don't change immediately the objectives. Normally change the way, but not the objectives, because it's too easy, and that leads me to monitoring and evaluation. How many evaluations are done with the criteria set for just before the team is sent out of the country? This is cheating. This is cheating. And more than half of the evaluation work is cheating in the international system. I'm really saying that. Because if you don't set the criteria well in advance as part of the project or the policy or whatever you want, and measure that, whether the results are good or not so good, or whether they correspond to your expectations, but at least you have a reference period to compare. But if you just tell the people, oh, I want to know this and that, and you make a kind of complaisance evaluation, that is not fair. It's not fair towards the people working in it. But it's unfortunately done because very often it serves people or agencies who have to be accountable towards their parliament, have then, let's say, less critical things. Nothing worse in communication than only to communicate the good things. If you are not courageous enough also to communicate failures or mistakes you have done, they will always find out. The journalists will, in a way or another, find it out. So I think in long-term cooperation, the ex post evaluation is always an input or practically an ex ante evaluation. And here, as you have also researchers in this room, I think what we could do better is also to make the actors more knowledgeable what research can do for them, be it in preparing programs, policy dialogues, or projects, and also what research can do in the ex post period to validate what you did, or to accompany your process, or to adapt your process design. But I think we don't do it enough. If I would go back and start again, I would definitely make more use of it. Another issue is output and outcome. It's not the same, but very often confusingly used. I mean, output is practically the means to measure your efficiency, what you put in and what you get out in your projects. But the outcome, if I make a project in Bangladesh in alphabetization of women, for example, 30,000 women is the output at the cost of $5 or $6 million. But then the outcome is, what do the women do with what they learned, as they are now able to write and to calculate? And the outcome is substantially higher. But we very often miss a realistic outcome mapping over time. And this could be a key to convince people to invest in development cooperation. I'm absolutely sure in communication we miss that train of outcome mapping for making people better understand how important and how well certain work is done. Some of you or the specialists have experienced this wave about 10 years ago, increase aid effectiveness. I was really angry about that OECD DAC issue, because that was practically saying we were not effective so far. Increase aid effectiveness. And then harmonization. I mean, what means harmonization? I mean, if in certain international part of the system you go for harmonization, it means you do nothing anymore. But I think we have to go far beyond harmonization. In various thematic fields, we should go for so-called national consortia. If you have to build road infrastructure, then bring all the stakeholders around the table and then all the partners who want to invest in that. But I did not make friends by proposing that, nor at the World Bank, nor with my other colleagues. And many of my ministerial colleagues, they often said, we have just to do more investments. But you cannot order investments. In order to do investments, you need entrepreneurs, or you need people who implement those projects where people are ready to invest. But it is feasible. And the new way now, or the new wave, impact assessment, there are schools in the US, there are a number of activities related. There is nearly an army of measurers around. Impact is important, and all the ingredients to have impact or to measure impact I mentioned are important. But we made a bureaucracy out of it. I think Robert Kennedy, the historian, he was right in questioning whether we measure the right thing. And my former colleague Andrew Natsios, he published recently a whole big article on the counter-bureaucracy of aid. When I look back 10 years and now at international aid today is far more bureaucratic. That is a result of this culture of measuring everything and anything. But we measure how many people are in prison, we measure how many things are. But do we measure how many people are happy? Do we measure the outcome? Do we map the outcome? Why? So impact assessment is important, and I say it because there is a new trend now going from microcredit to microfinance, and from microfinance now to impact investment funds. They are now coming up in Luxembourg, in London, in Zurich, in Geneva. This is nothing new, it's another word. But I am afraid that, again, we miss the boat. Why not be simple in saying and in being accountable for what we do? The donor's accountability is different from the actor's accountability. But for all of us, in a way or another, what you perceive is reality. But as a donor, you have a kind of an octagon of accountability. You are accountable to your government, you are accountable to your parliament, you are accountable to your population, you are accountable to the medias, you are accountable to the NGOs, you are accountable to the international partners, you are accountable to other partners in development. So you are accountable for so many things that people sometimes feel strangled. So break out of that, be accountable for what you do towards anybody, but the actors have to take risks for that. If we close the system from a system theoretical point of view, we don't have fresh air in the system anymore. And we don't have flexibility. If we go for a culture of zero tolerance for mistakes, we are definitely wrong, definitely wrong. That means we do not give new actors or certain actors the ground also to go into uncertainties and to take over risks. And this is a little bit the sickness with this kind of overarching accountability. Yes, you have to take risks. I was asked by a group of parliamentarians, how did you do 15 years? You had the budget altogether of 22 billion Swiss francs or dollars over your period of time. How did you do without creating or having a major scandal? And I say, yeah, I was lucky and I had fantastic people. But we also had a set of instruments and we made choices. We also had to take risks. We had to have partners. We had a fantastic NGO partner relationship. We had with the private sector relationship. But if you are afraid of taking risks, if you are not, I'm sorry to say so, an entrepreneur in development, probably you really end as a bureaucrat. And that is not what leads us to continuity. And when I say continuity, this means I experienced in my period of time many changes as the ministers of development cooperation. This is normal in political process. But most of them, when they entered their function newly, they had to change the legacy of the predecessor. So there were changes in structures or in policies. And sometimes they called and said, can you not take over that project? Or could you help me to do this and that? And it was amazing to see that. But continuity is, in my opinion, key. And if politics cannot afford the continuity because of other interests, then those who implement should try to go for that continuity. Because short-term thinking, like it is done sometimes now in private sector, this is not the way. It's certainly not the way to invest in partnerships in the long run. So we have to follow policies over time. And to end, what matters for success are always people, partners, results, and not action, costs, benefits, lasting impact. I remember before we had the sustainability discussion in Rio starting in 91 or 92, we had in Germany a discussion 10 years ago with Minister Eppler, the development minister of Helmut Schmidt, on the issue of durability. He always said durability is a more precise word than sustainability. Maybe he was right. Maybe durable means over time. Sustainable also means over time, but includes many more, but also many more dimensions for XQs. And when I proposed to include sustainability into our country's new constitution in a parliamentary meeting, the government rejected. The finance minister said, oh, if we put sustainable in, then everybody will come with a lot of requests. And they did not understand what sustainability means. So I had to go through a parliamentary initiative to bring it back. And now we have it in the Constitution. And it's important for the communities, for the cantons, that they can refer to this combination of economic development, of environmental sound development, of socially proof development, and of sound ethical basis governing the living together of these people. Local ownership, I mentioned how important it is. This has to do a lot with lowering the flag of bilateral actors, but it has especially to do with giving the people there a chance to bear responsibility. And accountability is simply a necessity. NGOs have to be accountable to the governments, to the community they are in. They are in a competitive environment. They have to anticipate developments. But they are not the only accountable people implementing. But unfortunately, national parliaments tend to look and to control bilateral projects and those of the NGOs in a much thorougher way than they do international financed projects. Nobody is looking into or controlling, or the financial controls is doing auditing in the World Bank. Nobody. But are they really? Yeah, they say you are part of the governing body. In the UN there is a kind of mixed. And in the UN you have a lot of people going there, I'm sorry to say so, unprepared. And we cannot blame the UN for what you sometimes read in the press, because the UN is we all who are part of that system. And that is why the work you do on policy coherence, on this European Forum, and on bringing the horizontal things together. I provoked my partners in my country by saying I forbid the word of coordination, because everybody wants to coordinate but wants to coordinate the others. I want the word replaced by participation. And those who have nothing to contribute, please stay away from the table. But the others, please come. We are listening to anybody having an issue, and that is how we built up the National Commission to look into coherence policies, not only in developing cooperation. Many of the other ministries or federal offices were very, very, let's say, shocked when I told them that development cooperation has a relationship with all their activities, be it in environment, be it in migration, be it in law, be it in security, and so on. There is no security without development. There is no development without security. But if we realize that, and if we make that understand, then we have worked the home ground, because that is as important to let the means, the financial means, follow for what we do with partners somewhere else. So thank you for your attention.